I'm pleased to introduce our next speakers. We have Mark Miller and Ted Vaughn with the Historic Agency, and they will be presenting on building a culture that attracts and drives success. So with that, let me turn it over to Mark and Ted.
Thanks, Bill. Pleasure to be here. Have to remember the camera in the back. So,
hello to everybody online.
Sorry for the static.
All right. Building a culture that attracts talent and drives success. We'll give you a little bit about Historic Agency. We are a strategy and design firm that focuses primarily on brand, culture, product design, in addition to traditional marketing. And we've been around about 7 years and work in a variety of industries, healthcare being one of them. And why we're here is you may have heard that Health Current changed its name to Contexture. And that's our doing, so hopefully you all like it. We walked them through a brand strategy and culture and renaming process that we'll kind of get into some of it today.
And as you may know, healthcare is probably the worst industry to develop anything new brand-wise. Everything exists.
Yeah,
it was incredibly difficult to find anything that was available.
So why are we here? Culture and healthcare, why does that matter? And the way we see it is, and you guys probably know these numbers, right? It's a $20 trillion industry. There's almost 1 million different companies in your sector, which is why it's kind of hard to come up with a name. It is the 4th largest industry among the top 4, real estate being the largest, state, local government, finance, insurance, and healthcare. So why does this matter? Well, if you know anything about real estate, you've probably seen Zillow disrupt that industry. You've probably seen OfferPad and other technology startups disrupt that industry. You've probably heard of this guy who has disrupted politics, good or bad. You've also probably heard of Venmo. And if you follow financial news, you may know this organization called Robinhood, which is commission-free trading, and has gotten into its own trouble for surpassing regulation with technology. So why do we see that is that healthcare, if you notice, hasn't been disrupted at the same scale as all those industries. People have tried. I know people in the industry that talk bad about Amazon for trying to get into this space. But what we know is that someone will come along and eat your lunch. It happens every few generations or 50 years or 10 years. And so we think that culture bad, all of those organizations had brands that or company cultures that were on brand, right? They good or bad, they were on a specific brand and it attracted and scaled and beat out their competition.
And we found time and time again in seasons of disruption, in seasons of market change, the organizations that prevail are the organizations that have that brand value, but it's driven from the inside of the organization out, which is a culture equation, which is why we as an agency take brand and culture and integrate them together, because we don't think we're helping our clients have a competitive advantage if we're not addressing how their brand shapes their internal culture, which is why we're here today, which is largely about the work we've done with Contexture. It's why we wrote a book on the title.
So here's our book. It's available wherever books are sold. That's my favorite thing to say these days. It comes out, it ships on the 19th, so you can pre-order on Amazon. But we're going to take you through some of the kind of insights that we've discovered over our work, and you'll be able to download tools as well. So if you're thinking about there's something misaligned in our organization, you can go to culturebuiltmybrand.com/tools, and you'll get the same tools for free that we used with Contexture and other clients to help them shape their culture and brand. Ted, you want to get into?
So the premise of the book is simply this. Any brand, no matter what vertical you're in, certainly in healthcare, want to have a marquee culture. A marquee culture is simply a culture like a marquee sign that screams attention that galvanizes your audience, that makes a promise, it gets attention. It does exactly what this marquee sign does at the Old Chicago Theater. If your culture can become that, if you can have a marquee culture, then you're able to deliver on your brand value, you're able to deliver a differentiated promise, and you're able to do it in a way that is more sustainable and more effective than just an external identity and promise with a culture that's not aligned. Really, for us, it's about brand from the inside out. So marquee culture is essentially what this book is all about, and we talk about the 6 layers of culture that develop a marquee culture.
So again, why does this matter? It's the triple bottom line, profit, people, and planet. Is anyone currently experiencing frustrations with trying to hire talent today? Maybe some of your companies. And what is being called the Great Resignation is people are waking up right past a pandemic and realizing that their values and their priorities actually matter, and their employer should match those values and those priorities, right? And so they're looking for telecommuting, they're looking for work from home, they're looking for a place that isn't going to grind them into powder. And so this is why a marquee culture matters. It's going to help you attract the people. It's going to help you live out values that are going to help impact the planet and ultimately drive more profit.
And right, wrong, good or bad, millennials and Gen Z are changing the game as to what it means to be employed, what it means to be in love with a company, what it means to have tenure with an organization. This triple bottom line speaks to culture way more than to bottom line revenue. So we believe that the way the world is shifting puts increasing pressure on culture more than it even does on revenue. 6 layers of culture, really quickly. And again, just to reiterate, are we a brand agency? Absolutely. Do we do websites and brand stuff? Absolutely. We believe, though, the most powerful form of brand is culture. We talk about 5 pillars of brand. Culture is the primary pillar. The 6 layers of integrating your brand and culture together: principles, architecture, going from top left to right, principles, architecture, rituals, lore, vocabulary, artifacts. All fun, practical, interesting things we unpack in the book. Today, we're going to go a little bit deeper into 3 of those layers, and then hopefully have time for a little Q&A. For the first layer, and we call them layers because essentially we believe they're perforated. When they stack on top of one another, when they integrate together, that's when you begin to really see the difference. It's not about picking the layer, it's about all 6 working together. So we're going to go deep on 3 today. And the first one we're going to address is principles, because actions speak louder than words. So Mark, what are principles?
So that's hot. We have all been in parts of organizations, right? There's values that are on the wall or in the bathroom, and we don't really know what they actually mean. We just know that we have to memorize them as part of the company.
Abstract terms like
integrity,
authenticity.
Right, and those are great things. We want people to be honest and have integrity, but the reality is your employees actually don't know what to do with them, right? Because they're not unpacked in a way that tells them how to behave. So principles for us is the behavior that you want to see happen so that your values are lived out. So again, values are not enough. Just some quick data, nearly 75% of employees don't believe in your values, according to Gallup. And then more than 50% don't know how their company is different than the competition, right? So there's this huge disconnect internally with employees around values.
Now, why does that matter to values, right? Company differentiation and values, aren't those different things? No. Your values do not need to be the permission to play values like honesty or the basics, right? Any customer, any person working for you assumes certain fundamental values. You don't need to name them unless they are uniquely differentiated important to you and your world, which in healthcare, there might be certain things that seem like permission to play. For instance, in the world of data, integrity might need to be stated uniquely for very specific reasons. However, in a lot of organizations, they don't need to say integrity because it's a permission to play. It's an obvious value. Your values, your principles, those need to lead to behaviors that differentiate you from other people in your sandbox. And if you don't have values that do that, you're missing a huge opportunity to shape a differentiated culture that allows you to be on brand in ways that separate you from the competition and give you a competitive advantage.
So again, principles are the behavior between value, your organizational values, your company values, and desired outcome.
So you may have a value that is stated around trust and transparency. The behavior now is how, the principle would be how you help your employees live that out. What does it mean for us as employees, as leaders in this organization, to behave in a way that demonstrates that value? It's amazing how often values become abstract concepts on a wall, like Enron, that you walk past every day, but they don't actually shape behavior. We believe taking principles and turning them into behaviors, taking your values, turning them into principles that actually help your people know how to behave in ways that separate your brand. A great example is Southwest. It's why the CEO, I always get it wrong, the CCO of Southwest Airlines wrote the foreword to the book, because when we look at Southwest Airlines, we see people that are on-ramped, hired in differentiated ways. They're equipped and developed to behave in ways that further the Southwest brand. It's okay if you're an introvert, but you better be an introvert who can be people-friendly, have fun on the plane mic, tell jokes, rap the instructions about wearing a mask. Because at the end of the day, Southwest wants to have a brand that has people furthering it, aligned from the inside out. We believe principles do that. Southwest is a great example of a brand that gets that right.
And again, if you go to culturebuiltmybrand.com/tools, you'll be able to download the tools we use to help you define your principles as an organization. All right, the next layer is architecture. And those are the structures that support your people, right? So that's how we define architecture inside an organization. And that could be how you hire, how you fire, how you budget.
Decision-making power,
Right.
Developing all of the organizational health stuff that often exists in its own independent space, right? There's a lot written on organizational health, on organizational structure, and most of it is written independent of brand. We believe those two should be absolutely integrated, much like in architecture designs a building, an architect designs a building unique to their context.
Right, and so we took this idea from Frank Lloyd Wright has, built all these different beautiful buildings around this philosophy of organic architecture. His famous quote, "The house should not be on the hill, it should be of the hill." And so just like your HR systems and how you do one-on-one meetings, all of that should be designed with the brand in mind. Because again, we say your people are the embodiment of your brand. If that is true, then every touch point they have inside your organization is an expression of whether or not they're going to align with your brand, or they're going to feel frustrated. How many people love doing expense reports, right? Nobody. And that's because they're generally designed by finance, accounting, HR, have nothing to do with the brand. At our company, at Historic, one of our principles is people-centered. So we believe that every process system should exist for people, not the other way around, right? I don't exist for Susie in accounting. I exist to help further the brand. And so we specifically picked a process that allows people to use their company card, they get a text message, they take a photo of the receipt, and their expense report is done. And so, again, you can start to see how different systems inside your organization can build frustration among your culture and your staff and lead them away from kind of the values that you actually care about.
And just like every one of those buildings, it's not enough to just have an organization, a structure that is stable. It's not enough to say, We design something and it's safe and stable. What great architect would raise that as a badge of honor and say, it doesn't matter that these look incredible or that they're designed to match their surroundings. What matters is that they've got the appropriate HVAC and infrastructure and they're up to fire code. Those are assumptions. It's the same in HR. You should assume health. You should assume the basics of caring about people. That shouldn't be the only thing that matters. We deeply believe that your HR structures, the structures that support your people, should be as on brand as your logo or your values or your print collateral or your website. There's no reason for them not to be. There's never been more ways for that to take place.
So ask yourselves this question: are your systems and structures supporting the right outcomes? Quick story, and you probably all have had this frustration, especially in healthcare. We were working with a client. They wanted to grow 300% in the next 12 months. So we built a strategy and a plan, and then they said it has to fit in last year's budget with the exact same breakdowns of different things. And you're like, you want to spend the same money and do the same things expecting a different outcome. And I believe there's a clinical term for that. And so what systems and structures are you actually doing to make sure that the outcomes that you want to see your brand happen are actually happening, right? And so Contexture is a great example of an organization that wants its brand to be known for more than just being a software company, that they're integrated into an entire healthcare system, and that their goal is to change that system through events like this, right? So what outcomes are you looking for, and are your systems and structures supporting that?
And because Contexture, talking appropriately and safely, Morgan, just throw a mask if anything goes off the rails here. Because they took this approach, as their brand rolls out and rolls out and rolls out and takes shape and takes more shape and takes more shape, it will be an example of a brand aligned from the inside out, because they're taking as seriously their internal structures and principles and values as they are their external branding and marketing and product design. And again, going back to the very beginning, we think that is the ultimate differentiation for the future. You will not survive all the disruptions coming to healthcare if you do not figure out how to have a brand that is aligned from the inside out versus just effective as a product.
So the right architecture attracts the right people. At lunch, I was talking with somebody about, again, this crazy change in crazy labor market and how people are expecting to be able to work remotely or telecommute, even if it's just part-time, right? And so that's an example of a system, right? Are you allowing your people, your workforce, to have the flexibility and freedom? And that's going to attract the right people. You want to add anything to that, Ted? Good.
Huh? Oh.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, yeah, you know what? I just want to let's make it personal. So we've got people, we've got a staff, we've got a brick and mortar. We've gone out of our way to embrace this idea, and Mark already shared about one of the ideas. Share a little bit about Travel Pizza as an example.
Oh, Travel Pizza, yeah. So we're a boutique agency. We're not owned by a big publicly traded advertising firm. But we want to, again, everything we do, one of our principles is people-centered. So we know that from time to time there's travel, and anyone who has kids knows the pain of one parent leaving and having to travel for work is not always the fun thing, especially when you leave. When you come back and you have stuff for your kids, that's usually the fun part. So what we did is to say, hey, let's create a benefit system that is people-centered. And so one of our benefits is what we call Travel Pizza. So if you're gone for more than 2 nights for work, for business at Historic will buy your family at home pizza the first night.
And like salad too, like not just pizza.
Well, we call it Travel Pizza. You can use the budget however you want if you don't like pizza. If you're
Travel Chinese.
Travel Chinese food. But that's made a huge difference in those who have families, even those who are just married or couples, because they know the family knows that we care just as much about them as we do the work the person who is our employee does for us. and it doesn't cost a lot of money. It's not like, providing, free health care for all your employees. It's, $40, right? So it doesn't cost a ton of money, but it makes a huge impact. And that's one way, again, your structures, your benefits package, which you guys are all probably very versed in different types of benefits for employees. But outside of healthcare, there's a lot that you can do to create a system that supports your people and attracts the right talent that doesn't cost a ton of money.
And these layers work together in partnership. A great example of that travel pizza is because it ties directly back to one of our values, which extrapolates to principles, which means if we're going to have this value and this principle that drives our people forward, we need to have a structure that supports them appropriately. Travel pizza was the perfect solution for us. What about you? Oftentimes we work with brands that have this abstract value of innovation. But when you look at how their people behave, the last thing they do is innovate. Why? Because risk is bad. There's a great fear of risk. Why? Because their architecture, because their structures don't reward risk, don't empower risk, mitigate risk, but they think innovation's sexy and cool, so they name it as a value, which ends up actually becoming a culture buster and a bit of a joke when you look at them from the outside in. There's all sorts of ways that your values should shape behavior, which should then in turn shape how you support and structure the systems for your people. And they can be incredibly differentiated and personalized. There shouldn't just be this cut and paste thing, well, we all do the same thing, right? Well, because you cover this, we will too. We have failed to imagine and innovate and dream about ways to architect our people systems better.
All right, the third layer that we're going to go over is lore, the sticky stories that shape us. So everyone here works somewhere. You all probably have stories that have been passed down about your organization, good and bad. I won't ask for those since some of you work for Health Current and Morgan's in the room. But those have a lot of power within our organization. And a lot of times, we think about the HR issues, or we think about even making swag. We'll put our logo on something, but we don't actually really think about the power that story has within our organization and what is it doing. So as a negative example, both Ted and I have them. At a previous job, I was brought in to do a turnaround at a company and lay some people off, bring in new employees in the marketing department. And one of the team members in an adjacent team, as I was going around being introduced, I was told how this person got caught sleeping on a couch in one of the offices. And from department to department, I kept hearing the same story. And it wasn't great feeling, right? I think people were thinking that it was kind of like a funny joke. But what it said was the organization, one, didn't have loyalty in return to you, right? Because they were talking trash about one of their own employees. And second, it didn't really care about performance. And so that organization had a hard time retaining talent because that was a symptom of their culture, right? They didn't actually value those things. And that came through the stories.
Another great example for me, I worked at a company for about 3 weeks and then heard that the CEO who hired me, one of my colleagues came up and said, Ted, you're just a plane ride away from losing your job. And I said, what does that mean? And they said, well, the CEO hired the guy before you on a plane ride. And by the time the plane landed, that person was hired, other person was replaced. It happened pretty fast. And there's kind of a pattern of that, right? So I'm now less than a month in, hearing stories, lore, that basically say you should feel very insecure, there's not much loyalty, we don't really care about you, and just watch your back. And what's interesting about lore and leadership, the higher up you are in leadership, odds are the most unaware or self-deluded you are to the negative stories that run rampant in your organization. Lore is one of the biggest ways we've seen brands fail from the inside out because there are stories that just go like wildfire that nobody in senior leadership ever actually become aware of, right? The big joke was I took that story to the CEO because I didn't know. I was like, hey, I heard this crazy thing. Is that true? Do you hire people on airplanes, and how does that work? Am I really in danger? And he's like, it's amazing. I've never heard that. And that story, that would have been 6 years old, that story. So it's been running around for that long. And this is the first time anybody's brought it to my attention. Lore, stories, they have an incredibly powerful way of shaping culture that is often way outside the control of leadership, which is why you have to be so intentional about mining for them and paying attention to them. And then, as Mark's about to share, telling positive stories that fuel your brand, planting those seeds.
Right. So an example of a positive lore. Everyone familiar with Patagonia, the clothing company and equipment company? This is their founder, Vaughn, and they were, up until his retirement recently, they were training all of their new employees would have to go and learn how to make a piton, which is the very first piece of hardware, climbing hardware that they made as a company. And that story got told, and how the company was founded, and the idea of this being the first reusable climbing equipment, and that idea of leaving no trace behind and having a sustainable supply chain, all of that was wrapped up into the story of how Patagonia got started. And it was told over and over and over again. And it was built into their hiring process and into their employee onboarding. Another one, Elon Musk and SpaceX. The story there, the lore being that we are going to put a man on Mars. We are going to do that in our generation, come hell or high water, whatever cost. And it could be a bad working environment, a crazy working environment, but that lore is what drives people to go work at SpaceX, and it drives really amazing talent to stay, even if the working conditions aren't great necessarily, given what I know about Elon. So those are examples of positive lore. Every organization is going to have both negative and positive. The best is not as leaders to kind of come up with our own stories and demand that everyone retell them, but to find a organic way of figuring out what are those amazing things that are happening or that have happened, and how do they connect with our brand, and how do we retell them?
Often this book hits the same mantra, and the mantra is have honest conversations with the people that you employ. I think too often we fail to hear the toxic lore. We fail to hear about their opinions of our rituals, which we talk a lot about, both organic rituals and control rituals. They find lack of meaning or hypocrisy in our values, and they talk about it with each other, but we don't ever hear about it because we don't drag those things into the daylight. We don't ask for permission to hear the truth. And I think often it's because as leaders, we're so busy running our organizations, we actually don't take the time to build a bridge over our power to the people who we're leading, to give them an opportunity to tell us the truth. And as a result, we suffer because we don't actually see reality. So one of the reoccurring themes is taking the time to ask the right questions, to draw out and expose the negative lore that might be holding our brands back. And the larger you are, the more it exists. The only question becomes, what are you doing about it, and how are you seeding different stories intentionally to help your brand and your culture be better and more integrated?
And that's a great segue to asking us questions. So online...
Is there a way for them to do that and ask questions?
I think there's a way for online people to ask questions. There.
Oh, great. Okay, so if there are any online questions or questions from you, because again, this is not for many an intuitive topic. Typically, brand has been seen as that thing that agencies do that's about creative, and culture has been seen as that thing that organizational people do. We're integrating them, and the further we go with this conversation, the more obvious it becomes to us as to how important it is. It's not just enough to be healthy. Healthy is being on brand.
Any questions? Yes.
I think my voice is going on. You have said two phrases, mining for lore and seeding lore. So can you talk a little bit more about the how?
So the how for mining for lore would simply be determining the appropriate way, depending on the size of your organization. It could be through your management team. It could be an initiative through all supervisors to take time and ask the question, hey, what are the stories that you hear about our brand? And put them in 2 categories. You could even say 3 categories. One category would be, yeah, this is a bad story. This is a neutral story. This is a story I heard that I think is really positive, that I think really speaks well of the brand. You do that throughout your organization. Give everybody an anonymous template or a digital template and allow them to say, yeah, here are 3 stories I heard that all basically say, you suck. It's anonymous, so they'll actually tell you. You now, as senior leadership, actually are privy to a whole bunch of stories. And if you hear the same story 10 times, it's probably a well-known story. Now, I would hope that there are also some positive things. But mining for lore is just determining how in your organization you can actually invite people to tell you the truth about the stuff they hear about the brand. Does that make sense?
Seeding lore.
You talk about that.
So seeding lore is going through, in the book we talk about a few other layers, rituals being one where you create experiences that your employees can actually experience the brand and live up to the expectations of the brand. So there's a couple different ways you could seed lore. One is by bringing stuff into the sunlight if it's bad, and then we had to do this actually recently at Historic. There was a story from a long time ago that some people knew, but we have a bunch of new people and they didn't know the context of that story, and we had to address it in a all staff meeting because people just started asking questions, right, and then start making their own conclusions about a story that they didn't have any context for. So in that case, we're taking what became negative lore and turning it around and seeding it as positive lore, so providing the context and why this thing happened and why it was so important to the history of our organization, and then telling that positive story over and over again in different opportunities. So that could be staff, that could be internal communication, it could be through your managers and leaders in their one-on-one meetings, but pointing back to that story and the value that it represents inside the organization. And then the other is making sure that you have a process in place to honor people and praise them when those on-brand experiences happen, right? So if it is a sales person who really exceeded expectations and really delivered the brand, not just the product, to a customer who's now super on fire and an advocate, elevate that and share that throughout the organization, whether, again, all staff or internal communication. We have a Slack channel called Praise, and anyone can post into it and tag somebody, and then we use that and to find those stories, and then we'll reiterate those stories.
And I would argue that when you get mentioned on the Praise channel, which there's no affirmative action, there's no, Mark and I never say, you really haven't praised Allison in a couple months. Let's give her some. It's totally organic. It is our people's way of doing tip of the hats to their colleagues. And that means as much to the people who get those as their comp. It's amazing how intoxicating that is. If one of the most undervalued ways of getting positive lore and of creating positive rituals in your organization that are organic is by building a system that allows people to reward or acknowledge or point out the positive attributes of other people, of other colleagues. And there's so many ways to do it. If you're decentralized like we are or distributed, use Slack. If it's, if you're in an office.
Or Microsoft Teams for healthcare people.
Right.
Sorry.
This is healthcare.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Bill wants to be on the mic.
Okay. Just so the folks on the recording and virtual can hear as well.
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued with what you're talking about with using brand to rebuild the internal architecture. So your comments about finance and accounting. But I'm intrigued with maybe any case studies or examples you have around the hiring process.
Oh, yeah. Do you want me to share the one from lunch? Yeah. So I'll share one which is really inspiring, but probably not as relevant, and then give you a tangible one that we do. So there's a company called Menlo Innovations. It's a software development company. They're the only software development company that I know of that puts 2 programmers in front of one monitor, keyboard, and mouse. And they do that so that they can learn from each other and check each other's code, and then they switch pairs every 5 days. And so no one magical architecture lives in one person. It lives within the entire organization, which is a common problem in software development shops. And so the way they interview is before they look at resumes, they bring people in and they pair them up and have them work on a problem together. And then there's one employee from Menlo who looks at how they're behaving. Are they collaborating? Are they working together? Is one person nice? One person being an a-hole? Is there leadership? Which one has more leadership skills? All that kind of stuff. And then they progress through the interview process. So that would be, in their philosophy, is that they want their workplace to be a place of joy and collaboration. So that's one way that they kind of modified the hiring process. The one way
Which is just really quick, Mark, a great example of how they have a value around collaboration, which speaks specifically to a principle of how they behave as employees, which speaks specifically to their architecture and how they structure their people, which speaks specifically to how they hire and on-ramp, right? These are perforated layers that work together, but you can't have a value that doesn't actually translate to a meaningful behavior or system or structure for your people. It's not a value if you have that, it's rhetoric.
Yeah, and a more tangible one that you can take away is at Historic, half of our team is distributed, so half of them are remote, and the other half work here in Phoenix. And we wanted a better onboarding experience in having people understand the culture and get to know each other, because some people are in the office and some people aren't. So even though this is kind of laborious, every new employee, when we hire somebody, all of the rest of the employees record a personalized video message for that new employee, and they include, who they are, their role, how they can support the new employee with questions and that kind of thing, what they love about the mission of Historic and what we're trying to do, and then what are the things that are broken about Historic and problems that need to be addressed. And so,
which, by the way, sends a loud message that says every single person here was allowed to say something critical about the organization I'm about to work for. Wow.
Yeah.
Now, hopefully, they don't go too crazy on that.
Yeah, well, and I actually don't watch them, so I just blindly
forward
them to the new employee.
Is it fascist to go back and watch all this?
Yeah, and it has made a huge difference because people get to know each other really quickly in a remote context. So if you have a distributed team or a hybrid team, think about doing something similar, maybe not organization-wide, but on a per team basis. So that's a couple ways that we've changed hiring.
Great question. Contextual people.
Yes.
One more, yes. We'll hear you and we'll repeat it for the people online.
My question is, you've spoken to culture and brand and private healthcare industry, and I'll give you a clue here. I work for a government agency, so I wonder if you could speak to your principles or your approach for government agencies in the healthcare space.
Yeah, obviously there's certain processes, right, that you're not going to be able to change overnight. So typically what we have done working in the public sector has been to address it on a small team basis and let it permeate up. It's a little bit easier to say we're going to change how Parks and, like the town of Gilbert, how they communicate internally with the Parks and Rec team and the kind of values that they want to live out and help them organize that versus doing the entire city at scale, because the police is its own animal, fire is its own animal. We're going to be able to work into that. But in other areas, I would just even speak to my father-in-law is a retired firefighter, and I was working on this book, and he was telling me how much a struggle it was to manage the culture within the fire department because it becomes so
bureaucratic.
Bureaucratic on the management
Crusty.
side because of the money it takes to run it, and then on the individual side at the local firehouse level, it becomes a fraternity, right? And it's really hard to break that stuff apart.
I think the single greatest challenge I've found in working in those industries is that there is There is a bureaucracy that exists that helps people preserve and protect things, and it gets institutionalized, and because it's funded through ways that are not market-driven exclusively, it is allowed to perpetuate longer. So there's a whole old-school command and control leadership model allowed to exist when the rest of the world has kind of moved on, right? It's like some unions still had people shoveling coal until about 1989. Just because they could, right? So I think to a certain extent, to Mark's point, this is all relevant, but rarely do we get a chance to go to the very top of the organization and in a perfect linear way, address it at the top and have it cascade down, and it's a wonderful world. It's usually more disruptive, and that works. In bureaucracies, you can go organic by starting with certain groups and trying things and letting it permeate out. Like, why all of a sudden is your team healthier, more excited, more effective, getting better numbers, and now you can ripple out. And it's true actually in academia as well. Yeah, similar problem.
One way to, as a tangible takeaway, is to think about, are you providing enough intent for your team, and then provide enough trust for them to make their decisions, right? And trust is a very powerful tool, but a lot of times we forget about the intent part, right? We give them specific instructions and then they don't execute the way we want them to, or something changed and they executed the way we wanted them to, and it didn't work because we didn't actually give clear intent. And that's something that the Marines are really good at in a government structure, is to give freedom, but be very clear about intent so that they can make decisions. And the power of trust inside an organization is very contagious. And it's very exciting, and it frees people up to start thinking differently. So I would probably start there, and I know it's kind of hard, but...
Last comment. We've often found that when there's a brand gap or kink or something's wrong and guys like us are let in to address or talk about rebrand, oftentimes what people think is a logo problem, we can help them understand it's a culture problem, or at minimum be given permission to address culture as a piece of a brand, holistic brand approach, which for us has happened time and time and time again, which is why we wrote the book, because we found, gosh, at the end of the day, that logo is amazing, but it doesn't matter if we don't get the brand right. So I hope that addressed your question. There's probably a lot behind that question. Yeah. All right, well, I think we're at time, but really appreciate you being here. For those that were online, thank you.
Thank you.
Namaste. Any final questions? Okay. Well, they go to historicagency.com is our agency, Historic Agency, just like it sounds, or culturebuiltmybrand.com/tools, and you can find out more about the book and download resources and tools and things that you can kind of in a skunkworks way start to apply to your companies.
Yep.
If you dare.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate it.